Anyway, one thing I haven't done. Oh, thanks to Paul for that introduction. I don't think I wrote all of that. But one thing I haven't done in this when I was doing the handouts for this, well, not the handouts, the slides for this talk, is to explain why my book is called Flighty, Melancholic, and Wild. These were the diagnoses that were made, when the York Asylum opened in 1777. It makes a lot of sense. Flighty is manic, really. Melancholic is depressed. Wild, well, who knows? But sometimes you could be flighty and wild at the same time, but not melancholic and wild normally. So let's move on. So what's the time? I've got to try and finish about past, if I can, and then to allow some time for discussion. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. Obviously, in 45 minutes, there's absolutely no way I can cover the whole history of mental health, 250 years. So I'm going to pick out just a few bits, really. So there won't be, it's not a smooth flow trying to explain everything. So if you want to know more, there's a book on the subject. We're going to start with a virtual tour of Bootham Park Hospital, previously known as the York Asylum, mainly because I realised it was in the offing that the hospital would at some point close. So I spent some time taking photos. I've got hundreds of photos of the interior of the hospital when it was functioning, a lot of which were published at the time in the press when they closed the hospital. And then we're going to talk about the foundation of the hospital, what went wrong, because a lot of things did go wrong, and how it was reformed. I'm going to mention two reforming doctors in the 19th century. And then I'm just going to talk about psychiatric treatments through the ages. Then if there's time, I'll talk a bit about why and how the hospital closed, which is a story and a lecture in itself, really. So I can't really cover it all. And then we might just look at some lessons at the end. History does teach us some things, and we do go around in circles, repeating things, making the same mistakes. So this is the tour. So we'll start. Let's see if this pointer works. Oh, yeah. Can you see that? Yeah. So we'll start. This is Bootham Park Hospital. At the time of the Selby and York Primary Care Trust. Does anyone remember that? I think it lasted for about 3 years before it was replaced by other trusts. So this was in about 1912. Well, not, sorry, 2012. Not that old. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is the hospital. So we will now look at where it's situated. There's the hospital there. This is the 1852 Ordnance Survey map of York. Now, if anyone wants to look at this map, it's fantastic, and it's available online. You just look it up, and you can home in on every single house in York. They did a fantastic job. So there's Bootham Park Hospital. Behind it are fields. That's where where York Hospital is now. Haxby Road, Wigington Road, Haxby Road, the Union Workhouse. That's part of that's still there, and it's now it now houses students very aptly. Yeah. Although, do they? Well, I suppose they have to work a bit. And this is all the hospital farms around this area. So it had its own farm. Now we'll home in on the hospital itself from the same map, and you will see the front part of the hospital that you've just seen, then the connecting wing, and then this is the female wing that still stands, that was built some years later. And these are the refractory wards that were demolished and replaced in 1932 with these two wards, which are, well, not replaced in 1862, but that's the 1932 map of the hospital. These little red things, you might wonder what they are. They're verandas, because at the time it was very popular to treat people in verandas, in sunlight, and also in the open air. So they bought beds outside, and that's the superintendent's house There was you can see there was a little bit added on there. The other interesting thing about this map is the airing courts. Every ward had its own airing court, which usually had a fence round, so the patients were taken out and were able to stay in the airing court without risk of them running away. So, so we're now going to enter the hospital on a tour. So this is just in the front entrance. What's happened now? What happened? This grand entrance was actually didn't appear in the hospital before the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s. Before that, it was very plain. So they spent money on this new grand entrance. This is a very short video that I did at the time. Let's see if I can play it. Where do I press? There we go. So this is the virtual tour. So the lady on the left is is the ward manager of Ward 2. So I came in on a Sunday to do this when I hope there weren't too many patients around. And she checked there wasn't anyone in the vicinity, so we could film it. Her idea, I think, was to make this into an introduction to the hospital for prospective patients. But I think it's would put people off, actually. Looks a bit scary, doesn't it? Yeah. A bit gothic, really. Yeah. So down on the left is the WRVS shop. On the right, you'll get a quick glimpse of Baldwin Wake, the painting that we'll come on to later. So we're coming to the end of the connecting wing, and we're going to enter the courtyard that in the old days was the kitchen yard. So all the dining halls and facilities were off to the left. And then we're going to go cross over and enter into the female wards that were built from 1812 onwards, and that's where Ward 1 and Ward 2, the last remaining wards at Bootham Park Hospital, were situated. Ward 1 was that way. Ward 2 is up the stairs. The Chantry Suite was a psychotherapy area that we developed in the 90s. So up the stairs, we're just going to stop at the top of the stairs. There was another film within the ward, but I think we had to clear the patient. I won't show you that. I haven't got it on. Note the stained glass. There's lots of that. And then we just go up to the entrance of the ward.
The tiles are very like the tiles here, aren't they?
Well, the tiles in the main building are Minton tiles. They're Italian tiles. Yeah. And the next picture, whoops, what if I pressed the wrong button? Here they are. These are the Minton tiles, and this is after they were restored in 1990, I believe. And I didn't take this picture, but it's taken looking down from the top of the tower, the main building, looking down at the tiles. So they look wonderful. Now, pointer. That's the new staircase. Well, it was built in late 19th century that replaced the staircase in the main building to create the grand entrance. That's one of the galleries in the main building, the old part of the ward. That's from the main building looking out towards the chapel, towards York. That's Ward 2. That's the bedrooms, single bedrooms going down there. Eventually, they're all en suite. That's Ward 1. Well, not what it was like when we were there. That's another cupola, which was added to the female wards at a later date. That's what eventually became the dining hall and was actually built as a bowling alley, called the American Bowling Alley. That's a bit more stained glass. This picture here is of Sir Geoffrey Dunstan. I put the Sir in brackets because he was a market trader from the East End, and in the late 18th century he was a famous wit, so much so that they even wrote a play about him that was very popular. So we don't know how this painting got to Bootham Park, but it was presumably painted at the time the hospital first opened, or indeed what's happened to it. We assume it's still there, and it will be sold to to raise profits for the NHS at some point, if it hasn't been sold already. So he was called the Mayor of Garrett. But people thought he was a patient, and it wasn't really a great portrayal of a psychiatric patient. So people did complain about that painting. That's Ward 2 when you get to the top of the stairs. This is the rec hall, which was added in the 1870s. That's as it was. It was used for lots of things, dining hall and also for recreation. Occupational therapy display of lace made quite a big profit. That's as it was at the time of closure. And this is as it was as a film venue. I don't know if you know what film that is. If you don't know, you probably don't know. It's The Long Shadow. Did anyone watch it? It was about the Yorkshire Ripper, and it came out in 2023, so it's still available on ITVX. And a lot of it was filmed inside Bootham Park Hospital, the empty hospital. This is the Grand Yorkshire Gala that took place really basically from the mid 19th century right up until 1923, and it was very, very popular with hot air balloons shooting off and all sorts of things going on. Note the chimney there. That was the heating system, setting a new steam central heating system for the hospital. And the gala, sadly, was closed. Basically, the board of control thought that it was too exciting for the patients, and they really shouldn't be exposed to this level of excitement, because they were meant to lie in beds and rest. So they stopped allowing it to take place. So it moved to the Knavesmire, and it was never popular there. It just lasted a few years and closed and folded. So it was a great Yorkshire event. People were asking me, where were the cells and chains and all the things in the hospital? And I said, well, there aren't any as far as I know. But down below the female wing, there are cellars that I have been down, and there is some kind of bath in there. It's about 6 foot long. It's quite big. It's still full of water, so I've no idea what it was used for. The other basements, if they exist, are under the older building, and you can't get access at the moment. So who knows what's down there? So we'll just have to wait until they redevelop the hospital and try and get access then. Right, now we're now going to go on to talking about the setting up of the hospital. Why was this hospital set up? Why is it important? And it all started in 1773, and it started with good intentions. Basically, psychiatric patients, lunatics as they were called, were looked after by the parishes. And after the 1601 Poor Law Act, the parishes had to provide for dependent people within their parish. But the problem was later on, well, in the 18th century and beyond, they moved to places like York or places where they could get jobs, particularly with the enclosures of land. And therefore, when they became ill, there was nowhere for them to go. And this is why a lot of these asylums were built. But the York Asylum was only the 5th one to be built, and it's the only one still standing. All the others have completely disappeared. So it's quite unique in that sense. The first one was the Bootham Hospital, known as Bedlam, which was founded in the Middle Ages, and then St Luke's Hospital in London, 1751. That's gone completely. I think it's a roundabout now. Manchester Lunatic Hospital, that eventually moved to Cheadle and became Cheadle Royal, which still exists, but not in the original building. And the Newcastle Lunatic Asylum did not last very long. And so there we are. So the other thing was in York, St Leonard's Hospital, huge hospital, the largest in the north of England, run by monks, looked after the sick and ill of Yorkshire or York. but that was closed by Henry VIII during the dissolution of the monasteries. So for 200 years, York had no hospital at all until the York County Hospital was established in 1750. But the York County Hospital didn't allow lunatics, so that wasn't any help really. So these gentlemen got together. There were 24 of them, and they all put in money, and they advertised in the York Courant for a meeting, and they advertised for people to pay money called subscriptions. One of the leaders of this group was Dr. Alexander Hunter. There he is on the left. That's the same as a picture that we have of him in the mental health exhibition. Um, he was someone who liked setting things up, but not always following through. But because he had so many interests, and he wrote loads of books. In fact, you could write a book on him. Taking the Waters, Trees and Agriculture, Men and Manners. In fact, in my book, I used a lot of his aphorisms, and used them against him, actually. Because some of them were about doctors. He also wrote about cooking, and his book is called Culina Familiatrix Medicinae, which is a book on medical food. You can probably still get hold of it. And it's very apt, actually, because his house was 62 Low Petergate, which is now an Italian restaurant. It's called La Vecchia Scuola, the old school, and it used to be a school after he. So I haven't eaten there, but I must. And apparently, on the next floor up, there's a staircase the same as we have, with snakes on the banisters. For some reasons, snakes signify doctors, but I don't know. And the Archbishop of York chaired these meetings. The architect was John Carr, who many will have heard of. He was basically the foremost architect in the north of Britain, or north of England, in the late 18th century. He was responsible for the York Grandstand that still stands, the Assize Courts that are still there, Buxton Terrace in Derbyshire, Harewood House, and many bridges. And a lot of these bridges still carry traffic. I discovered that when I walked up one of the rivers, and there's another John Carr Bridge, So yeah. So that was him. So it was a grand design. In those days, the idea of hospitals often was to have a grand frontage, and it wasn't always so great inside. What you saw on those pictures that I just showed you were later additions. It was probably very plain inside when it was first built. This is the committee room that still exists, and these are all these subscriptions. And I used to spend a lot of time in there in meetings, and my mind would wander, and I looked at all the people who subscribed to build a hospital. If you look at this list, you'll see Baldwin Wake there, who we'll come across later. There's Joseph Rowntree, of course, George Hudson. Others are, I'm sure, psychiatrists or my colleagues will remember someone called Mordecai Cutts, Esquire. No? He was on one of the walls. And I used to think, when they were cutting all our services, I was going, yes. Mordecai Cutts donated 21 pounds. Many women donated. Mrs. Strangeways was one. And groups. There was the social club at the York Tavern. There was the social club at the Black Dog in Jubbergate. They both donated each £26 and 5 shillings. That is a lot of money in those days. The Merchants' Company in York, £105. And the Marquis of Rockingham, £105. That's £15,000 or more now. So yeah, rich people did put money back into society in those days. This is the John Carr building, and you will see that's it in about 1800, and that's it now. and you'll note the cupola or bell tower and the chimneys all belching out smoke. They were all removed during the Second World War and afterwards because they'd become unsafe, and it seemed better in those days to get rid of them. That's the ground floor layout. That's very much as it is now, apart from the staircase, which I explained has been moved back to create the grand entrance. There's the committee room, still there. There's Dr. Blenkiron's office. Oh, there's. Well, I think, yeah, people know these rooms very well. Spent a lot of time in them, except it wasn't a billiard room. We didn't have a billiard room. That's a shame, wasn't it? There were 2 billiard rooms I can see. Okay, so moving on to the setting up of the hospital, and the aim was to accept anyone in need. You see the staffing was 8 altogether for 54 patients. And there was a matron, 3 men servants, 3 women servants. In those days, there were no nurses as such. These were untrained people who looked after the patients. And they were later called attendants. And the patients were expected to assist, particularly the patients who were normally servants themselves. So I don't think the more middle class, well-off people were expected to serve. They were served by the other patients. That's the way it was in those days. There was a visiting apothecary and a visiting physician who was Dr. Hunter. They didn't. The physician didn't get paid. He also didn't get paid to visit the county hospital or the York dispensary, which was a service for the poor. But Dr. Hunter didn't visit the York dispensary. I think he was too busy doing other things. So the fees were 8 shillings a week, but more opulent patients were charged more, and the money was used for the poorer people. The reason they wanted people who'd come in and be able to be discharged, and the discharge rate was, to start with, the first 200 patients was in the region of, let me try and remember, 45% were discharged within a year, and a third stayed less than 4 weeks. So they didn't stay that long. And, you expect people to stay in asylums for the rest of their lives. They didn't. Some did, but not many. No women with child. Now, this wasn't because they didn't like children. It was because they didn't. If a child was born within the hospital, there was a possibility that they would then claim upkeep from the parish, and the parish was St. Olave's, and the hospital didn't feel that St. Olave's would be that happy to have to look after loads of destitute children. Okay, on to admissions. I'm just going to describe 3 in the first time. Here they are. Admission number 2, they were all numbered, was William Blanchard from Barnby in the Moor. He had melancholia. He was discharged. The date's wrong there. It should be 6th of December 1777. So he was discharged only a few weeks later. Relieved, in quotes. And Joseph Spink, admission number 3, was flighty and wild. And he was cured, and he was discharged very soon after admission. So these are patients who did improve. Admission number 610 is a famous admission, really. And you can quite honestly say that she changed the course of psychiatry, probably throughout the world, by dying, basically. And she was a Quaker widow from Hunslet Carr in Leeds. Her husband was a stuff weaver, and she had 5 children. But prior to her admission, she'd lost her husband. He died, and she'd lost 3 of her children. So she had 2 boys left, young boys, and all her family were buried at buried in the Quaker cemetery in Leeds. And I have gone to look for it in Hunslet Carr, and I did find it, and there's a plaque there. It's under a car park now. and Hannah Mills was only in hospital for about 6 weeks, suffering from melancholia, and she died. And the problem really for the Quakers was that they weren't allowed to visit, and that they were really upset about that. And it sort of raised the profile of this can't happen really, and perhaps misguided, but perhaps with good intention, because one of the problems with asylums in those days was if you take the Bethlehem Hospital in London, people paid to go and visit the lunatics and look at them, you know. So maybe the reason for not allowing visitors partly might have been, if I'm generous, was to not allow that to happen really. Anyway, this all came to the attention of a York tea trader and grocer called William Tuke. And his daughter said to him, why not found your own hospital for Quakers? So he said, well, why not? So he did. It took a lot of time, really. Well, 7 years from the concept to the opening of the retreat, which was originally for Quakers only. The George David Jepson was the petitioner for Hannah Mills. All admissions had to have a petitioner. George Depson became the superintendent, and Catherine Allen was the matron, and they married. And this sort of fostered the thing about the hospital being a family, which was one of the things you could say about moral therapy, which is and mild treatment, which is what the retreat became famous for. What is moral therapy? It's being nice to people and treating them kindly. And there were more staff, they were better supervised, minimal use of restraint, suitable activities was the key thing, exercise and fresh air. So that was the traditions of treatment. So it's very simple. Samuel Tuke, who was the grandson of William Tuke, wrote the famous book Description of the Retreat in 1813 that became a bestseller. So what you had in York was a tale of two hospitals. You had one hospital that was, you know, world renowned. It became and for doing all the right things. You had a hospital that wasn't really, where people were treated probably largely like they were in a lot of hospitals throughout the country. So why did it go wrong at Bootham Park? Sorry, the York Asylum, as it was called. As I've already said, the norm wasn't that high, really. The bar was not set very high for the care and treatment of people with psychiatric illness. Mental health patients were treated not really as humans in some instances, possessed like animals. In some places, like St. Luke's, for example, there was no heating. There was a lack of light. They slept on straw on the floor. Restraint was used a lot, and they were cared for by untrained and unsupervised staff. So you can imagine that things would go wrong. And the other thing that, looking at York more specifically, it expanded from 54 to 188 inpatients, with an extension at the back to provide rooms for these patients. And there was no increase in staffing. So can you imagine, 8 staff looking after 188 inpatients? The governors were meant to visit, and they didn't. They stopped visiting. So it was, and Dr. Hunter, as I've already said, was doing other things. Ongoing at this time was the Napoleonic Wars, inflation of 75% for food, which was possibly one of the reasons for the expansion, because they had to get money in somehow to pay for the care. And they didn't have the advantage of the Quaker Hospital, which presumably had grants and bequests and money was paid for it. And also there was the madness of King George, was taking place at that time, his first episode of illness. William Wilberforce just happened to be a Yorkshire MP, and he wrote quite a number of letters to William Tuke, and they were communicating, trying to say, why is this situation so bad? The original principles had been watered down to make more money. Dr. Hunter had been encouraged, or he admitted more affluent patients, and then wanted to keep some of the money for himself, which he did, and so money was siphoned off. The fire in the back of the hospital made things much worse because the patients were then all moved into the John Carr building at the front, and there was overcrowding. And I've already mentioned the contrast with the other hospital in York. So things were heading the wrong direction. So what happened next? What happened next? We'll look at the key players really at this time. We've already mentioned, I think, Charles Best, who was the doctor who took over from Dr. Hunter when he died. This is him, and this is his wife. The other key players are William Belcombe, who's there, and here, Godfrey Higgins. Charles Best married a lady called Mary Norcliffe, and there's a lot of connections, and you could write a thing about this with between what was going on in psychiatry in York in mental health and Gentleman Jack, who at least two of her girlfriends became mentally unwell and were treated in York. But Mary Norcliffe's sister was Isabella Norcliffe, who was the great love, or one of the loves, of Gentleman Jack. She didn't become mentally ill. So Dr. William Belcombe was the visiting physician to the retreat. And he also set up his own private asylum in Clifton, just off Clifton Green. Now, this chap over here was the second president of the York Medical Society. He's called Belcombe, Henry Belcombe, and he's the son of William Belcombe. And he took over the Clifton Asylum after his father died. But there was rivalry between these two doctors, which built up and built up. And the problem was Charles Best didn't objected to a number of things that were said and published by William Belcombe. I mean, it was all built up, first of all, with this book about the retreat that I've described. The book about the retreat, about describing moral treatment and mild treatment. Because when William Belcombe opened his private asylum, he said, we follow mild treatments like the retreat. And Charles Best took this as a personal affront. And instead of keeping quiet about it, he wrote to the press as a vigilator, which means to be vigilant. And he used lots of war type cannons and things, and it became a laughing stock. There were letters flooding in from other people with all sorts of different names. It's really quite fun to read them. I think in those days the entertainment was really from the newspapers, far more than these days. I mean, the letter pages were fascinating. So all he did was raise the prospect that the York Asylum was perhaps not a very good place. Then enter Godfrey Higgins, who was a magistrate from Doncaster, Skellow Grange, and he was a reformer. And he sent a patient called William Vickers to the York Asylum in court. He sent him from the magistrate's court. He was there for 6 months, and he came back, and Mrs. Vickers went to Godfrey Higgins to complain. He was in a terrible state, filthy, infested with lice, unable to stand, legs swollen. Later on, they found a mark of a shackle on his leg and a lash on his back. So Godfrey Higgins decided, look, we can't do anything about this. We've got to collect evidence. So with him and a number of other reformers, they became governors. They paid to become governors of the York Asylum, and then they decided to collect this evidence and then hold an inquiry, which is what they did. One example I'll just mention is Reverend John Butterfield Shorey, who was one of the evidence cases, who had a number of admissions to the York Asylum. and was treated badly. On one occasion, he was kicked downstairs. And Eliza West, it was found out later at the national inquiry, was from Louth or Louth in Lincolnshire. Louth in Lincolnshire. When she went home, she was pregnant, and it was discovered that James Backhouse, who was an ex-keeper, he'd since left to found his own asylum, his own private asylum in Gilgate. He paid for the upkeep of her child, which was sort of proof that he was the father of this child. So that's just one of many examples. So he had the evidence, and they started collecting it, but he realized that no one was really going to do anything about it, because most of the staff it wasn't really taken as seriously as he wanted. And then the incident of the hidden room and the poker took place, which I'll talk about in the next slide. This was sorry, before that, I'm going to go back. I'm really sorry. I haven't mentioned the fire in any detail. Basically, I won't, because there isn't time, but the whole of the back of the hospital was set on fire, and only one keeper was able to remove patients. Two were out. There were meant to be four there. Two were out, having locked the doors, locked the patients in. One was there. One was too old and infirm to do anything. The supervisor, the one in charge, was 81 years old and lived in the lodge, and he came out when he heard the commotion, and he actually locked the gates, the front gates off the main road, to stop all the population coming in, because he thought they were rioters, and in fact they were coming in to try and put the fire out because the hospital was on fire. So he just made the situation far worse. As far as we know, 2 patients died. Their remains were discovered later. But as I said, following the fire, the patients were then all moved into the main building. So it was massively overcrowded, which led to the hidden room and the poker incident. Surprise visit by Godfrey Higgins, 24th of December. Sorry, it's not 24th of December. I've got the date wrong there. It was in March, 24th of March, 1814. And he went into the hospital. He said, open all these doors. And he found a door that the staff wouldn't open, which was in the main corridor. And he said, in the kitchen area. And he said, open this door. And they said, we can't, we haven't got the key. So he fetched a poker from the fireplace. And he said, if you don't open it, I'm going to break the door with this poker. And so they found the key. And he went in there. There were 4 empty cells I've described there, in an absolutely disgusting state. But there were no patients in them. They'd moved them out because that's where they slept. And it was absolutely disgusting. I won't go into detail. He called in the other governors, and this is the quote: "I will never be satisfied until the Augean, is that the correct pronounce, stables be swept clean from top to bottom." The Augean stables are basically it's from a Greek legend, and Hercules was set the impossible task of cleaning the stables of King Ellis, which had been left for 30 years and contained 300 oxen, and he did it by diverting 2 rivers. But but all they had really was the inquiry. So they called a big inquiry that took place. Now, let me just find my notes. Yes, call for justice. He wrote to the press. On the 25th of August, 1814, there was a big inquiry in the Guildhall, which was packed, and the decision was made at that inquiry to sack all the staff and start again, basically, and start again having the apothecary being in charge, and the physician actually having responsibility. But strangely, despite all the staff being sacked, Dr. Best wasn't. He carried on. He was allowed to carry on. But the shame was too much, and he left York, and he went to Nice, and he died 2 years later. Although he did leave £3,000 in his will, huge amount of money. So that was the end of Dr. Best. So following this, there was the York Asylum became a model hospital. And I realize I'm running out of time because it's so interesting, that first bit. So I'm going to have to shoot through fairly quickly. So for the next 90 years, things were where it was a model hospital following the principles of moral therapy. Lots of fresh air activities. The farms were built, as we've seen. Monitoring from lady visitors, Board of Control governors. And then the County Asylums Act was in 1845, and pauper asylums had to be built. Every county had to build a pauper asylum. And that's when Clifton Hospital was opened, 1847, and eventually Neyburn Hospital in 1906. Those are two well-known patients. I won't go into, there isn't time for them. I want to talk about Baldwin Wake, whose picture we have in the library here. We managed to rescue it from the hospital, and the moment we're waiting for, we're looking into restoring it. He was one of the reforming doctors. He was visiting physician at the York Asylum. And he was president and founder of the York Medical Society in 1832. He actually worked at the York Dispensary for free. He lived at Blake Street. He supported Mary Best when she came back to the UK and her family. And one of them is a famous painter, Mary Ellen Best, and these are her paintings. Some of them are in the Yorkshire, the York Museum, the York Art Gallery. The photo's not very good because I had to open a drawer to find it. And the other one is Marygate. You'll recognise that view, looking at the entrance to the park. So, and he was also big on the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, on the council. He was also a pioneer of forensic psychiatry, but I'm not going to talk about that today because there isn't time. And when he died, he as part of his will, £100 went to the asylum, which is £15,000 in today's monies. This is a view of which is quite an interesting print from about the 1850s. There's the York Asylum. See, with its, and look at all the fields around there. Yeah, so. And that's the York Philosophical Society who ran the museum gardens. They owned and developed the museum gardens. Frederick Needham was another fairly pioneering and well thought of not psychiatrists. They called them alienists at that time, and he. Actually, he was the son of James Needham, who was another president of the York Medical Society in 1868. Frederick didn't have any time to have anything to do with the Medical Society because in those days, medical superintendents, the law had been changed. They had to spend all their time running and looking after the hospital and running the staff, living in the hospital. So it was a completely different ballgame then. But couple of case examples, just if you could just give me a quick diagnosis from the early 20th century. Hiram W, 65, butcher from Royston, short, stout man with white hair, admitted 1909, 4-week history of threatening behaviour and confusion, albumin in his urine. How did they know? They got urine over a candle and boiled it, and if there was a residue left, that's how they found albumin in the urine, which was Bright's disease, which is disease of the kidneys. So he had that. His face and mouth were down on one side. He had a history of intemperance, heavy drinking, and the family locked him in a shed really because they couldn't cope with it. And 2 months later, he was fully recovered. What was wrong with him? No guesses. Well, it was some kind of acute confusional state, wasn't it? Or TIA or something, or alcohol withdrawal. It could have been a number of different things. Sarah B was from Darlington, 30 years old, 6 weeks of bizarre behavior, refusing food, had to be fed with a nasal tube. Sadly, this lady died 8 months later. And I think at the York Asylum, there were probably around 2 deaths a year for people who died basically of mental illness, which is mental illness where people don't eat or they get exhausted, which just shows that if you don't, untreated mental illness is dangerous, not just from the risk of suicide, but from the actual illness itself. Now, I'm just going to do a quick run through psychiatric treatment through the ages. We've covered a few things already. The exhibition next door in the Tempest Anderson room covers some of these treatments. This is a picture from the exhibition, which shows cupping and scarifiers, which cut into the skin to release blood. These treatments were all related to the humours of the body. And I won't go into any detail about those. But basically, you admitted someone, you made sure they were, if they weren't eating, they were fed, they were contained if necessary, and kept safe, given sedatives, what was available at the time. Hydrotherapy was used in some cases. And spinning or swinging, you can see a picture of some kind of spinning therapy. There was evidence that there was some kind of swing at the York Asylum, because I found a record that the swing was disposed of, which was in about 1810. So they did have something like that. Oh, there's a shower, and I wonder if that was something to do with that bath down in the bottom of the cellars. Who knows? Post-retreat, we've already talked about treatment post-retreat, which is the principles of moral therapy, i.e. looking after people and caring for them. Sedatives improved. We had chloral hydrates, formaldehyde. Chloroform was used at Bootham very briefly. It wasn't really a useful treatment. It was a bit dangerous, but it was tried out. But the problem with moral therapy is that the asylums, the huge asylums, the pauper asylums became too big. And with a lack of staff, too many patients, they couldn't really provide that sort of treatment to the way it was meant to be provided. But Bootham, being small, maximum of 200 beds, was able to. So it became quite a model hospital for its time. The period between 1900 and 1960, I've described as the era of experimentation, because it was when that science was coming to the fore, and people were saying, well, there must be ways we can treat these terrible diseases like schizophrenia, which never really got better. So the attempts at the York Asylum, Dr. Hitchcock, the physician superintendent, tried to avoid sedatives altogether. But as you can imagine, when patients get completely exhausted and can't sleep, it's a problem in itself. There was the development of the psychotherapies, which was mainly around the time of the First World War, with shell shock, and numerous people were treated at the asylum. Occupational therapy, you've seen that was part of moral therapy, carried out by the attendants, then the nurses, and then the profession of occupational therapy that developed from about the end of the First World War onwards. Bed rest, we've talked about already. Dr. Jeffries was an exponent of bed rest, verandas and fresh air. The York Asylum was a pioneer of voluntary admission. The asylums, the big asylums, the pauper asylums, how many people in those asylums do you think was admitted voluntarily? Have a guess. 2%. No, well, zero. Because to get into an asylum, because of the Mental Treatment Act, well, it was called the Lunacy Act of 1890, you had to be detained by a magistrate. So, but the York Asylum was able to admit people voluntarily, and by 1912, half of the patients were voluntary. And And in fact, they were asked to present their findings down, what they did down at the in London to the Board of Control at the time, because people were interested that, surely it's better to not detain people against their will all the time. Malarial treatment for GPI, general paralysis of the insane, which is which is basically tertiary syphilis, which was a scourge in the 19th century, and it was syphilis affecting the brain, and it caused dementia and death usually within about 3 or 4 years, and weird delusions like being Napoleon, etc. And malarial treatment was a way of inducing a fever to get rid of the infection, and it did sort of work to some extent, but was quite risky. Was not really used much at Bootham because actually what happened is before penicillin was invented, the tertiary syphilis, the rates of syphilis were going down. It seemed to have lost its virulence to some extent. Insulin coma therapy for schizophrenia was used between 1936 and 1957, a dangerous treatment, as you could imagine, giving people insulin to cause coma. Huge risks, but they thought it worked. Interestingly, in 1957, I shouldn't really say that's the year of my birth, that's terrible. They did a randomized controlled trial of insulin coma therapy for schizophrenia in the hope that it would be used more, which was strange because people weren't using it. They didn't really like it. It was too dangerous. And so they did this randomized controlled trial and found it was no better than placebo. So it went out of use. And at the same time, the antipsychotic drugs were coming into being. ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, from the 1940s onwards, that was a revolution, because patients with depression, mania, usually stayed at the York Asylum and other hospitals for up to a year. But with ECT, they're out in 3 months, better. So ECT was led to a major change in the treatment of melancholia, severe depression. And of course, people seem surprised, but it's still used nowadays for severe depression. That's the ECT suite at Bootham Park Hospital before closure. That's the ECT suite at Foss Park Hospital, which is the new psychiatric hospital in York. I think the only difference there is you've got a nice view of the ceiling when you're lying on the couch. I won't talk about leucotomy, lobotomy. That wasn't much used in York, although there was an operating suite at Clifton Hospital, so it was used a bit. Well, between 1960 and now is the revolution, really, which has just transformed the way psychiatric treatment is provided, and it's provided treatments that actually work. And I divided it up into social, legal, and pharmacological. I mean, there were changes when the NHS was founded in 1948. Bootham Park joined the NHS, became an NHS hospital. In practice, it didn't really have much choice because it was running out of money, and the NHS took it over, and it eventually became the main hospital for York, for psychiatry. But we already had voluntary admissions, open door policies, outpatients were being developed, therapeutic communities. And there was a push really that started with this man, well, around the time of this man, in 1961, with his famous speech called the Water Tower Speech. Do not for a moment underestimate the powers of resistance. They did resist, and it wasn't really until 1980, the 1980s onwards, before the Victorian asylums, as they were called, were closed. Before that, and right up until the mid 1990s. Legal, I won't talk about the changes in the Mental Health Act, which made it a priority to treat patients in the community. And if you wanted to admit someone, you had to give very good reasons for that. Pharmacological changes, well, I'll just mention chlorpromazine, 1952, which was gosh, I've got way beyond my notes here, which was first used by someone called Henri Laborie in France. And it was a promazine, which is a type of antihistamine. And some psychiatrists he was working with tried it out, and it was effective. And it actually seemed to make delusions and hallucinations better. And it was called 4560RP. And these drugs work on the neurotransmitters in the brain. So that was the first one, and there's been loads more since, as you can see from the list there. Antidepressants were developed in 1958. Mood stabilizers, the first one was lithium. Lithium's talked about a lot at the moment. In fact, we're getting it out of the ground in Cornwall. It's discovering this morning, aren't we? And it goes in batteries. But it was present and it is present in the waters of Harrogate in small quantities, which may have calmed down the people who drank the waters there, because it does have a calming effect. And it wasn't really used much till the 1970s, despite being discovered in 1949. Care in the community. I've got another 5 minutes. Is that all right, Paul?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, and then we'll finish. Yeah. Care in the community from the 1990s, really. So I sort of came to York with a brief to get involved with care in the community. I was called a community psychiatrist. And we had 4 multidisciplinary teams at that time. And our aim was to have short waiting times. So I think 4 weeks was the most for a non-urgent appointment, and 1 week for an urgent appointment, and immediately for an emergency appointment. So those were the standards. I'm not sure how much they're being allowed nowadays. I mean, it's not happening really. Community units for the elderly. 9 were planned, 7 were built, and 0 remain. They were the result of the cuts in which took place from 2002 onwards, and they've been converted into other things or sold. CAMS, I better mention that because Barry's here. Many developments in CAMS, Barry. Yeah, that's it. And then from 1998, specialization, things getting very, very specialist, with the first in Europe was the assertive outreach team, and then moving on to home treatment. The problem really in the present day has been the changes in general practice as well, in that general practices have become much bigger. In the 1990s, we could all link with the small general practices. We could visit them. We could discuss patients. So then they came up with this idea in about 2014, I think, 2015, of having a single point of access. What we did is we liaised and linked with GP practices and discussed referrals rather than just sending them in. So, which leads to a build-up of waiting lists. This is the North Sector CMHT base where I started, which was meant to be temporary and stayed there forever. This is the Pauper Wings. It's quite hard to get a view of them, so I had to go up on the railway bridge or beyond to view across the railway lines to see those. That's one of the new ensuite bedrooms that were built in 2010. Quite a lot of money was spent on Bootham Park Hospital then. There isn't time to talk about the end of Bootham Park Hospital, which is a major story in its own right. If you want to know more about that, just read the book, really. It's gone really, and I think the chair or somebody from the CCG said it demonstrates that a bunch of people trying to do the right thing can do the wrong thing, because it was closed with just 5 days' notice and it had to be emptied. It's for sale now. It's been for sale since 2017. The new hospital, Foss Park, opened in 2020. There was an intermediate hospital which was a conversion of Peppermill Court, which was a Q unit. So Bootham Park closed in 2015, and Peppermill Court opened in 2016, a year later. So there were acute wards in York, which kept things ticking over. So patients didn't all have to be sent out of York. But for a period of time, for a period of a year, there were no psychiatric beds for adults. There were beds for children in York at all, and had to be sent out of area. So Foss Park opened at a cost of 40.6 million in 2020. It opened without any ceremony because it was during COVID times. So that's the end of my talk. This is Bootham Park. This is Bootham Park now. I'm going to come back to that, but lessons of history, I think they're all there really. I think I've probably covered most of those while I've been talking. You know, what can we do? What should be done? I mean, asylum, a safe place. The problem is wards have become less safe places now partly because there's less beds, and people who come into psychiatric wards now are much more iller than they were. 30% of them are detained or more. So they're not very relaxing places well, they never were completely, but they're less relaxing than they used to be. I guess, yeah, so that's, I won't say anymore. I could leave that there, or I could just go back to that and take questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Bob. I should say that Bob is donating his honorarium from tonight to the York and District Mind, with which we've had links over many years. And I just want to say thank you very much. That was a great trip down memory lane for me, certainly from the pictures point of view.
In your office, Paul.
Yeah, see, many of the things there which haven't changed a bit really. I do reflect that perhaps we do go in cycles of change and learning and relearning from the past, don't we? And I think we will do again. And I was pretty interested to hear that Bootham Park, that's what started life as a place where everyone could come. If there wasn't any sort of restrictions on it, it's welcoming. And then it went through that bad phase, and then the sort of heyday phase. I like to think that it still did have some key figures there. Yourself amongst them, of course, Bob, who would actually pioneered all those treatments there. And I thought it was a fascinating talk. I am going to just say that Bob's book is available. If you do buy it from here, you get £5 gets donated to your Medical Society.
That's correct. Yeah, it's £20, £5 to
yeah. So £20 is the overall cost, is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you want to buy a copy on the black market or even on the white market, I think certainly it's available in the library there. So does anybody have any questions for Bob? I'm sure there will be some. After the question, Bob, why is it that when they're about to close psychiatric hospitals, they spend more money on them than they have at any time during their history? £4.5 million on converting it to single-sex accommodation, £1 million on the Cotford Day Hospital. Is it a sign that people, that's not really a question, it's more a common observation, is it that people spend a lot of money on buildings at the point that they...
Well, they don't actually, because when they closed the Victorian asylums, they were run down, and they were in a really bad way. Right. So
okay.
But maybe in your figures,
Certainly,
they were ambivalent, I think. In York.
Yeah, it did take a while to close properly, didn't it? Even after it was closed.
Yeah,
Greg.
Bob, you have to be the amount of research you put into this book is absolutely outstanding. It must have taken you days and days and days.
Yes.
And I think we congratulate you on all that work you put into it. I'd just like to make a statement about Neyman Hospital, which you hardly mentioned. But in Yorkshire, to train in psychiatry, you went to Neyman. Bootham was a battlefield. All the proper training happened down at Neyman. And, it's just the way these historical things move. Bootham Park wasn't that important. It's Neyman.
Well, maybe when you were there, Greg, but they did combine Bootham I think in the early 60s. They combined the two hospitals together, so they functioned as a whole. Bootham Park, our neighbour, were well.
You went up the route.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. That's right. Yeah.
And I'd like to ask, do we have a need for any psychiatric inpatient units at all now? Why can't we just do it all in the community? And that's a controversial question for those people on Zoom there. Do we have need of any inpatient facilities at all in the 21st
Well,
century?
in the 1960s, they with the closure of hospitals, they thought that they could manage without hospitals and just have very small units tacked on to what were known as district general hospitals. And these were called DGH units. Quite a number of them were built. The problem was that not everyone gets better, and these units, would just fill up with patients with chronic and long-term illness. But your question is, why do they need a hospital? Yeah.
At all? Yeah, I know there's some models that Steve there's in the audience. He's been over.
Well, it depends. You just have to see how, if someone's severely unwell and is very, very agitated, high risk, wants to die, wants to harm somebody else, is in a really bad state, is not eating. You've seen all the things that I've been talking about that can go wrong, and you cannot manage those. And they won't take medication. When people get to that level, you have to have a place of safety, a place where treatment can be provided in a safe way. And the question is how many beds do you need? My view would be that we don't have enough now. We have too few, because what we're seeing is people are going to private hospitals. They're being sent all over the country. When you want to admit someone acutely, there's no bed, and patients who are high risk are being managed at home and not admitted. People are being discharged too soon. So I would say it's gone too far.
You would see that when you tribunal work, wouldn't you?
Absolutely, yeah.
Detention, high
I see in tribunals people who have been. It's taken 4 months, for example, of being acutely psychotic and unwell and high risk before a bed's found, and they're managed in the community. And you think, why didn't they just admit them and treat them? They would have been better. But that's what's happening now.
Yeah. So
hopefully not here. Maybe not here in Europe, but certainly other parts of the country. Yeah.
Barry,
you've been involved in poor practice, but also some very good practice. You've talked about the moral approach. The retreat was also involved in a lot of stuff in the mid-90s around exercise and sport and outdoor activities and doing constructive, positive things, quite revolutionary stuff of its time. And some of the Your Medical Society presidents were involved in that. So my question to you is, what's the next one of those really positive, innovative treatments that psychiatry has to offer, and will York be at the forefront of those?
Gosh, that's a
pick that question, Bob.
Barry's asking me, what's the next innovation in psychiatry? What's the next big thing? And what is York going to do about it? What's York going to provide? Is that right? Yeah. What could it be? That's a very interesting question.
Neurology.
Neurology. I've got to think about that one a bit. First of all, you need to get the services functioning properly first, and you need to be able to get care and treatment arranged when it's needed, and that isn't always happening now. So you need to get that working. But you're talking about treatments, yeah? Well, activities, useful activities is very important. So, providing, places where people can go, where they feel safe, where they can do things in the company of other people. It costs money. It's usually has to be funded by social services, usually, or somebody. But having a community like that is a way forward. And I think indeed that is happening to some extent in York, and as far as I'm aware.
Social prescribing is essentially, that would be an innovation.
Yeah.
Rebranding. Do we have another question from the audience? Yes, Nick.
In the 1970s and early 80s, I was outside of London, chairman of the social services thing, and we used to visit in Bath. And it was quite clear that there were schools maybe hundreds of people who shouldn't have been there. And in fact, the resettlement community was in fact quite successful. What seems to be missing in your story is the more normal tale where there were the disappeared patients who disappeared into these hospitals and never came out.
Well, I have got an answer to that. It's where did all the patients go? You know, when they closed Neighbour and Clifton, where did all the patients go? They were looked after, and York did very well, and it monitored all those patients, and it was called the York Monitoring System, and there was research projects following these patients, and they went to all sorts of options: group homes, residential homes, to living, going back home, various ways. But by then, a lot of these hospitals were full of more elderly patients. So, you know, they needed more physical care. Because what was happening when these hospitals were closed in the 70s, 80s, was that there was a much more elderly population, because younger patients didn't stay in hospital. They got treated and discharged. So the age group in the hospital got older and older. So, you know, they needed care homes and support so a lot of them did. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
It's a complex issue, really. Yeah.
I was thinking that, you know, it's interesting that the Yorkshire Gala was considered too exciting for the residents, and I can't be said for tonight's talk, of course, but we're all still in the room with you. It's developing. Yes, other question then.
And we've obviously seen closure, and it's now being developed into luxury. If you had a magic wand, what would you hope this lovely old building?
Right. Well, there's been lots of discussion about that, and one of the ideas was put forward was to have a mixed use, and they hoped the council would buy it for next to nothing, and then let it out for various uses, which was a community centre, some kind of some of it being housing, supported housing, some of it being offices, some kind of mixed use. But I mean, the retreat is residential, and that was a firm were interested in buying Bootham to do that, exactly that, and that was for elderly people with care needs. But you had to buy your flat. But that they had a cafe, they had a cinema. You know, they were going to make it into it was quite exciting, really. But they pulled out. Really at the time of COVID, around that time, and it was, I think they realised the cost was too great to convert. So it was sad, really. So I think what I would like for Bootham is something to happen to it. And I even spoke to the people who were developing the retreat, and I said, "Why haven't you bought Bootham and developed that?" And I think I heard, but I don't know if this is true, that they did try, or the cost was too great. I don't know. Bootham is currently owned by NHS Property Services, and their aim is to sell for the highest possible price. But surely keeping it empty for 9 years is a massive price to pay. Yeah. That's what they should do. They should sell it for £1 to someone who will look after it. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. And I'm now going to say